because the first step of every pen test is Recon. And everyone in this room, is there anyone in this room who hasn't used Nmap? Anyone? Bueller? No? Good. Because Nmap is the Recon tool as far as I'm concerned. I start every pen test with Nmap. The whole point of Recon is to really drive right in and figure out what's out there. You know, it's walking into the dark room and turning on your flashlight and shining it around, trying to find out exactly what's going on in that dark room. And there are some keys to Recon. Most people pop open Nmap and just type Nmap IP address range /24 go. And it's noisy and it's easy to catch, and especially if you're doing a pen test where it is target unaware, where the target doesn't know you from a real attacker, the goal is not to be detected. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about Nmap use here. We're going to talk about how not to be detected, because that's where this gets really interesting. I'm going to assume that you all know how to use Nmap to at least some level of competence. If not, it's not that hard. Nmap-H should give you pretty much everything you need to know as far as how to do that. So let's talk more about stealth, about how to stay undetected. Because your goal, especially when attacking a small environment, is to stay quiet. You know, if you're attacking from the internet at large, you can get lost in the noise. But if you're attacking from, if you're attacking a target that's not particularly high visibility, you know, if you're scanning Amazon.com, no one's going to notice. If you're scanning Joe Bob's little web application developer, where their servers are relatively well protected and relatively quiet, you start to stand out a little more. And especially as you're scanning the inside, from the inside. Internal networks require stealth. They require being quiet. So, 2 overall strategies to stealth. As far as I'm concerned, there really are only 2 major strategies for being quiet. What are they? Anyone want to take a guess? So, all tactical. Those are all tactical objectives. Give me why would you do that? What does that do for you?
For example, so as not to set off a certain rule that's so many packets from the same IP address on different ports in the same amount of time.
So, can I generalize that to the strategy itself? Sure. Generalizing to the strategy, do something they're not expecting. Right? Or specifically, do something they're not looking for. Either be different than what they're looking for, lengthen the time interval so that you're outside the time interval that they're looking for. Do stuff that makes your scan not something they're looking for. There's another strategy. What is it? What were you going to say? And that's, again, being what they're not looking for. The other way of being stealthy is to make it somebody else's problem. So if I'm scanning you, but it looks like he's scanning you and I'm not involved, then I'm as stealthy as I need to be. They'll chase him all day long. Those are really the 2 points. You either change your traffic so that it's something they're not looking for, or you change your traffic so that it doesn't come from you. Those are the 2 real points as far as stealth. Everything else is just details. If you can solve those 2 problems, think about everything else as just being details. And I guess there actually is a third. As I look back at the slides, I was reminded of the third. The third is don't be anything at all. Passive traffic observation, which we'll get to in a second. So actually, we'll start with passive traffic observation. I didn't use my own slides. I used the slides for this deck that are on the DVD that you guys have. So we'll start with passive stuff, because passive is actually the nicest of all if you can get it. If you think about it, most scanning requires active connections and active interaction with the target. That's where those other two strategies of stealth come in. But if you can avoid connecting to the target at all, or connect to the target in a completely normal way, actually browse to it with a web browser, for example, and then capture the traffic and use it passively, use a passive analysis tool to analyze what's in the traffic, that's beautiful. Problem with this strategy, and don't get me wrong, I love this strategy because it has some real advantages. It has some real opportunities because you don't have to necessarily even connect to them. If you can get them to connect to you, it's even better. The disadvantage is this doesn't always work. You know, you don't always have the opportunity to connect to a target in a normal way. If it's a web server, then obviously you can just browse to it. If it's a database server and you connect to the database port, it's not quite as stealthy anymore. You know, you're actually connecting to the database port, and they're going to get a message in their logs like invalid connection from your IP address, right? So there are issues to passive traffic observation. If you can use it, it's fantastic. It's the best of both worlds, right? You get all of the information you need, and you don't have to deal with any of the issues. But the problem with it is you can't always use it. The nice thing about it is you can do all kinds of stuff with it. You can grab TCP timestamps, you can do OS identification, you can do all of that stuff. So basically, if you have solid traffic and you can use POF in the right way, you can get all the information you need. So I'm not going to stand up here and tell you all about POF. I said I would say this over and over again. It's better to use it than for me to stand up here and effectively recite the man page to you. So we're going to use POF in the next lab exercise. All right. The one thing I will talk about with passive observation is that often you will figure out that NAT is happening. And you will figure out that NAT is happening when you notice that a box is giving really weird identification info. You'll look at it and you'll go, man, this just does not make sense. None of this makes sense. It'll look like a Windows box somewhere and a Cisco router other places. Well, guess what? It is. It's a Windows box some places and a Cisco router box in other places. That's what NAT looks like. If you don't know that that's happening, if you're not aware of that, all you're going to notice is it looks weird. And I've seen a lot of people get tripped up using POF, using passive fingerprinting, when they just say, this doesn't mean anything. This doesn't make any sense. What it actually means is that you've got to think through what all the results are and pull out the information you need. You know, pull out the difference between the target host behind the NAT and the NAT box itself. So, again, like I said, I'm not going to stand up here and talk all the way through all of the different forms of POF. But what we will talk about, hold on, I lost my slides, is that other mode of stealthing yourself. So I said earlier, one of the real keys is to be someone you're not. One of the real ways to avoid detection is to make it look like it's coming from someone else. Does anyone know how you would do that? Can you think through how that would work? Well, there's actually only a couple. Spoof a packet, but it doesn't come back to you. How do you get the data from it? If you can listen passively on the network, that's a beautiful opportunity. Again, that brings us back to POF, though, right? If you can just get a traffic dump, then you could, I mean, you don't even have to spoof traffic. If you could just listen, you just listen until that host talks and then just use the passive fingerprint. But I'm talking about actually scanning a box and not doing it yourself.
And that has a utility to bounce it off an FTP server.
FTP bounce, that's a good one. Does everyone know what how FTP bounce works? All right. FTP bounce attacks are actually old school. And for the most part, they don't work anymore. Every once in a while, you'll find an FTP target that this is useful for. If you have an FTP server that allows you to log in anonymously, what you can do, basically, FTP has a command called port. Port is a command that allows you to specify which port you want the FTP server to communicate back to you on. So you can log into an FTP server and issue the port command to a remote host. If that port is open, it will connect appropriately. If that port is closed, it will throw an error. Think about this. I can log into an FTP server, issue a bunch of port commands to his box, and I'll get either errors or good connections to his box from the FTP server, not from me. Beautiful attack. Beautiful way to scan, recon an entire network from that FTP server without ever doing it myself. Problem. Not very many FTP servers on internal networks are anonymous anymore. Doesn't work too badly on the internet if you think about it. Lots of anonymous FTP servers still kicking around out there on the internet.
What about creating a web page where it's a JavaScript application where the clients do scanning for you? So whoever gets your page, they scan them and JavaScript reports the results.
Absolutely beautiful. Yes, absolutely. Another way to do it. Relies on somebody connecting to your web page, so it might take a little longer, right? You know, you've got to get them to the page first. But brilliant, absolutely beautiful. A great way of forcing someone else to do it. There's another way that's a little bit more RFC compliant, shall we say. Built into TCP/IP is the idea of idle scanning. So when you connect to a host, when it connects back to, like when it sends a packet back to you, it has an IP fragment ID. With every packet it sends, it increments that ID. All right? So I've got a host that I connect to your laptop. When it sends back a packet to me, it sets the IP fragment ID to 1. When it connects to Don's box, or when Don connects to it and it sends a packet to Don, the IP fragment ID is 2. When it connects over here, the IP fragment ID is 3. And when it sends its next packet to me, I'll see 4. Right? This is simple math. I feel like the count from Sesame Street. 1 packet, 2 packet, right? That's the whole thing. Now, why do we call it idle scanning?
Is this a zombie? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm not talking.
I don't because the box has to be idle to bounce.
Right. It's called idle scanning because if the box is idle, you have something really useful. Right? So, say his box doesn't talk to anyone. Some printer over in the corner that no one ever talks to. If I scan it, if I send it a stream of packets, I'll see a steady incremental fragment ID. Say I send it a packet. I get 1. Right? I get 1 back. I spoof a packet from Don's box, or to Don's box. Don's box sends it a packet, and it responds. He gets 2. If I send it a packet, I should get 3. If he gets no response, I get 2. I can now tell the difference between whether or not he got a response from that box over there. Right? Where this relies is on the ability to use, to use ACKs. Right? So if I send, I'm looking for the right slide because I'm out of order. If I send effectively the right packet, if I send a SYN to Don's box, I get a syn ACK back. He'll send an ACK, or he'll send a reset, depending. You will send the packet to Don's box, at which point your fragment ID increments. When I then connect again, I will see that you have sent a packet. This all relies on one really important thing. Is this making sense? This is pretty obvious. It's a pretty obvious theory. Again, easier to see in practice, but it's a pretty obvious theory. What this all depends on, and people just, this one, this is the key to this whole thing. And I'm going to drive this into your head by standing up here and saying it like really definitively. You have to listen to this thing. It all depends on finding a box that nobody talks to.
Predict the packet that's coming back and being incremented by 1 instead of 4 because 4 other boxes talk to it.
Right. And I will, so the reason I'm driving this into people's heads is because I stand up here and I say this every single time, and someone scans a box and they're like, man, this thing's got like 40,000 open ports on it. Well, that's because you just talked to a box that everyone else is talking to. And the tool doesn't know the difference. The tool doesn't know the difference between it incrementing the number and it not incrementing the number because someone else is talking to it or you're talking to it. The tool that you're using for idle scanning thinks that anytime the IP increments, the port's open. So if someone else is talking to it, you're going to see a lot of open ports.
Shouldn't it at least know that it's in increments 1 and 2 that bad results?
Yeah, it should. But the problem with that is that would assume that that it's doing a long enough wait and that it's not sending 2 packets, for example. It has to make sure that it gets everything in order, right, for it to do that. So as a shortcut, rather than taking 15 seconds between each packet that it sends, it shortcuts and just assumes. So it's not as, you could probably write a tool that was sophisticated enough to do that, but for the most part, the tools don't. For the most part, the tools basically just look for that increment. Make sense? All right. The last one, and this was actually the first one I talked about, the last way of evasion that we're going to talk about today is effectively low and slow. It's what we've always called it. It's always been called low and slow. You get out of evasion by, as you said, ensuring that your packets that you're sending are not what the IDS is looking for. Right? You can do that by changing the type of packets, by going from a SYN scan to a TCP Connect scan. Used to be that a Christmas scan and reset scans and all that stuff worked really well, but now every IDS in the world looks for those. So those are pretty well detected. The best way in the world, if you've got the time on an engagement, the best way in the world to evade is simply to slow down. Send one port, connect to one port every 30 seconds, or every, hell, if you got the time, 90 seconds. No IDS in the world has got a large enough state table to keep track of all of the different connections across 90 seconds, 120 seconds, 180 seconds. The scan just disappears in the noise because it's slow enough. If you were a real attacker on the internet and you had the time to spending, a month scanning a target, this would be the way to do it. Unfortunately, the problem with this is in most penetration test engagements, you only have a 2-week window or a 3-day window. I think that test we have next week, we have a 4-day window to do everything. We're not doing this, I'll tell you that. So if we're going to evade, we're going to do it either with idle scanning or we're going to do it, or we're just going to write into the rules of engagement. And I think that's actually what we did. We just wrote into the rules of engagement that we're not going to bother. Hey, guys, we're going to nmap you, deal. Because who has the time to deal with this? And for the most part, which of your clients have the time to pay for you to do this? You're not going to do this as often in the real world of pen testing because it's a controlled environment. But realize, if you're defending, if you're on the defensive side, this is what a real attacker is going to do. Why wouldn't they? If you have a motivated attacker whose goal is your environment, not an environment, in which case they can just scan the whole internet and find somebody. But if the goal is your environment, this is what a bad guy's going to do. Go.
You can evade an IDS by slowing down. What does an IDS do if you scan multiple hosts in a stall manner?
Some of them will find you. It depends. So I think Snort's got a decent cross-host processor at this point. A lot of the commercial ones probably wouldn't notice.
You can put in source words as well.
Yeah.
So that's where your IP comes in.
Yeah. What I would actually probably recommend if you were an attacker, do it across 5, 6, 7 IPs, and hit multiple hosts that way. That way you're not as tied in. That's something we've never really done. Came up with that on the fly. We should write a parallelized version of Nmap that can recorrelate the results. You know, that would be kind of neat. Maybe next year for Black Hat, I'll write one of those. You could need multiple subnets. You know what? At the point where you're going that slow, it doesn't matter. The whole question, I think your question was the idea of how do we speed up the really slow scans by using multiple parallelized scanners. You might want more subnets to make sure that you're staying evasive, but when you're going this slowly, it's probably all going to disappear in the background anyway. Other questions on the stealth stuff? I mean, really what stealth comes down to, if you're not passive, if you're active, what stealth comes down to is either disappearing into the background noise by being something that it's not noticing, or by being somebody else. One more time, I'll drive it into your heads. Idle scanning, you have to pick a host that's idle. I know that sounds obvious, but I guarantee at least one of you is going to go, that doesn't look right. What's wrong with this thing? It's not what's wrong with this thing. You picked a host that wasn't idle. Other questions before we start Lab 1? Anyone? Just so you know, in the book there is a Lab 0. It's for anyone who's not familiar with Linux, Unix, hasn't played around on NIX systems at some point. If you feel like you want to run through Lab 0, go for it. I'm going to give you guys enough time to go through both.